A message from Lucas Walton from the Walton Family Foundation, a funder of this event.
Hi, I'm Lucas Walton from the Walton Family Foundation. We're here today to talk about big problems, but also innovative solutions and the state of what is a complex problem in the face of climate change for the Colorado River. The Colorado River is ground zero for climate change. This is a crisis that involves all of us. We care about the Colorado River as a foundation and as a family. We realize how important it is to America. We realize how important it is for tens of millions of people who are affected every day by the ability to have access to water. That concerns me for the next generation coming down the line. I think that there's hope for the future because I see innovation, because I see creative solutions, and in that, we are seeing voices come together to have a common conversation in a way that we haven't seen before. That gives me hope. That allows me to look forward and say that so much more is possible. There's a better version of us out there where both people and the environment can thrive together. If we can come together to find solutions for nature and people, we can create an example that communities around the world can look to.
Funding for this program is provided by
July 24th, 2024, live from the Hoover Dam Spillway House. Welcome to Tipping Point, Colorado River Reckoning. I'm Miles O'Brien, the science correspondent for PBS News. Tonight, we're going to focus on the hardest working river in the nation and the urgent work that needs to be done to forge a new agreement among 7 states, 2 countries, and 30 Indian tribes on how best to share it. Rapid growth in the West, coupled with a 2-decade-long drought fueled by the climate emergency, has brought us to this moment of crisis. The agreement to share this overtaxed resource expires at the end of 2025. With less than a year and a half to go, the clock is ticking. Tonight, we'll speak with water managers, politicians, academics, and advocates, all of them thought leaders on this complex subject. And we want to hear from you as well. Send us a comment or a question wherever you're watching this live stream. The questions will get funneled to me, and I'll do my level best to get them in front of the experts here with me at the Spillway House. You might say we have a lot of water behind the dam. So let's get busy trying to understand the challenges and look for the opportunities. But before we do that, a word on the remarkable place where we sit tonight. Rising from the floor of the Colorado River, the Hoover Dam stands as a monumental achievement in American engineering and determination. Construction began in 1931, the depths of the Depression. Thousands of workers flocked to the Nevada-Arizona border, driven by the promise of jobs and a chance to contribute to this colossal project, the Apollo moonshot of its era. A dam in Boulder Canyon was first proposed in 1922 by Arthur Powell Davis, director of the Reclamation Service and nephew of the famous explorer and geologist John Wesley Powell. In 1869, he led the first scientific expedition to navigate the entire length of the Grand Canyon. The dam was conceived as a way to tame and tap the Colorado, providing flood control, irrigation for agriculture, and a dependable water supply for Southern California. It was an essential element of negotiations to share water among the 7 Colorado River Basin states. Mediated by then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, the talks led to the Colorado River Compact in 1922, the foundation of a complex series of agreements, court rulings, and treaties known collectively as the Law of the River. The dam was finished ahead of schedule in 1936, creating Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States. When filled to the brim, it can sustain the desert Southwest for 4 to 6 years. The Hoover Dam is the most famous feature in an expansive network of dams, canals, pipes, and pumps that harness the Colorado River, sustaining more than 40 million people and irrigating 5 million acres of farmland. The Spillway House offers up a spectacular view, as you can see. After all, it was built to monitor the Hoover Dam spillways. Now, they are channels designed to release excess water from Lake Mead when the reservoir gets too high. The last time those spillways were needed, 1983. The story of what has happened since is recorded in the white calcium carbonate deposits on the canyon walls behind me. They are a stark visual reminder of where the reservoir used to be. 2 years ago, almost to this day, the lake reached an all-time low, 1,040 feet. That's 181 feet below full. Today, it's a little higher, 1,062 feet, which is about 1 year's worth of water at current usage rates. That doesn't mean the taps will run dry then, however. Lake Mead is like a water checking account, and for the past couple of decades, the withdrawals have far outpaced the deposits. And that's what this reckoning is all about. For more on this, we turn to John Fleck. He is the writer-in-residence, Utton Center, University of New Mexico School of Law, the author of 2 fabulous books on the river. I recommend them to you, and those of you true fans of the Tipping Point series will remember John from our previous special on the Colorado River back in November of 2021. A lot of water has gone through the dam since then, right, John?
Yeah, a lot of water, but perhaps less than in the past. Right?
Yes,
We're making
indeed.
progress.
Well, let's do, I think we should do a little bit of contextualizing here, if we could. We got this fabulous map here, and let's talk about this region and this river. First of all, this is as dry a region as there is in the United States, right? I think people in the East kind of forget that little detail, right?
Right. This is a very dry region with a single important river at its heart, and so anyone who wants to use water in this entire region has to end up looking to the Colorado River, figuring out how to get some of that water to the places where they want to live.
All right, so we got this very important blue line, navy blue line, which begins up in the Rockies and ends down in the Sea of Cortez there. That's the main stem of the Colorado. You see some of the tributaries there. It is a river that is heavily utilized, to say the least. I think it's worth, we're sitting here at the Hoover Dam. That's one of, I count, if you count some of the tributaries, it could be 100 dams on the system, which is an extraordinary feat of engineering. Let's just talk about that for a moment in the, the context, the sweep of history. How big a deal is this effort successful to tame this river?
So when the United States moved west, and we wanted to build an empire here, sweeping aside, importantly, and we'll talk about this, the indigenous communities that were here, and we wanted to build farms and cities, the only way to do that was to reach out and tap into the Colorado River, and it took the construction of dams like this engineering marvel behind us and canals to move the water out to the cities and the farms that we wanted to build. And it succeeded in marvelous ways. Like these cities that we know and love, places that I've lived my entire life, are made possible by our collective action as a community of a nation to move this water to the places where we want to use it.
We really would not be here were
We
it
would
not
not
for
be
this river. So, but it is a two-edged sword, isn't it? At the time, the go-go days of reclamation, when they were building dams like crazy, there wasn't much consideration for the environmental consequences.
We had no concept in our sort of cultural value system of the intrinsic environmental values and the values of the indigenous communities that were here before us. They were the go-go years. We wanted to build these farms and cities, and we pushed everything out aside. And our values as a society are changing, and that creates real challenges for us.
So it seemed like limitless growth for a very long time.
For a very long time. It took us all through the 20th century to finally build out all those dams and cities and farm communities that we anticipated and planned for a century ago when we started this great collective project.
Are we at the limit now?
We are at the limit now. The bathtub ring suggests perhaps we have overshot the limit.
All right, so the last time there was a water sharing agreement between the 7 states depicted here and the country of Mexico was 2007.
Right.
That expires at the end of 2025.
Right.
That seems like a short period of time. Negotiations are extremely complex when you start talking about water in the West, right?
Yeah, and we sort of entered during that time period, going back to 2005 and even before, what has amounted to a period of permanent negotiation among all the different water users and the states and the communities in the basin, trying to figure out how to reduce our use to accommodate the fact that we've overshot.
So this may sound like a stupid question to those of you who understand the nuances of the river, but why can't everyone just share equally?
Right, so everybody has this belief, based on all the rules that we wrote over the 20th century, that they're entitled to this much water. And everybody has a lawyer with a good legal argument for why they get this much water. There's only this much water, there's not enough water for all the lawyers to be right, and it's very difficult for people to compromise and to recognize that my community could still exist, could still thrive with less water. Even though we have an enormous record of success in using less water, it creates this sort of limbic fear that we're going to run out of water, and that's a characteristic of life in the desert, this fear of being without water.
You mentioned the indigenous cultures, and of course we talked about the environment. What are the chances in the context of this big negotiation that those parties will have proper seats at the table, meaning the environment will get its due, and so will these Native American tribes that have been left out in the cold?
So it remains to be seen. It's frankly, for those issues, not going terribly well in negotiations right now, because the people who have the power in the water are reluctant to give up enough of the power in the water to let these new interests have a place at the table. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think as a society, we need to come to that reckoning. I don't think we're there yet.
What happens if the states cannot come to an agreement?
So we could end up in court, and I've had fascinating conversations with legal experts about the umpty-jillion different ways lawsuits could happen. But we would, if we do not collectively come to an agreement about how to share the river, we will enter a legal system that will impose water use reductions, because nature is going to impose water use reductions. We can't use water that's not there.
I don't think nature is listening to judges necessarily, right? Yeah, so well, that doesn't sound like a very good outcome.
No, it doesn't.
What will be a good outcome is if you stick around and join us toward the end of our live stream here and help us answer some of the questions that are going to come in from the audience. So as always, John, good to have you here as a co-pilot. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Miles.
All right. Before we get much deeper in the depths of all this, let's spend a few moments learning some basics. For that, we turn to an expert who has worked for nearly 40 years, trying to understand how rivers work and how to manage them. He is the director of the Center for Colorado River Studies at Utah State University. Jack Schmidt. Jack, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time. When obviously supply is going to vary and climate change is only making matters worse, help us understand why the demand doesn't respond to the supply or lack thereof.
The reservoirs on the Colorado River are the largest in relationship to the flow of the river of any watershed in North America. So in one sense, we've had a mentality that we would always be buffered and protected by the amount of water in the reservoirs. The other piece is we are a very highly regulated, very complicated administrative and legal structure that governs how water is allocated and who can use it. It's collectively known as the law of the river. The sum of all that is a very convoluted, very complicated structure of administration and legality. We don't have a structure in place that can adapt quickly to the changes. It's a very complicated thing to try to get politics to stay up to speed in its adaptability to a changing climate.
The original agreement to share the Colorado River was negotiated in the 1920s. At the time, California was growing quickly and wanted to tap into the river right away to sustain agriculture and the fast-growing cities of Southern California. But farther north, states in the Colorado River Basin were growing more slowly. They didn't need the water then, but they wanted to preserve their right to use it in the future. And so the river was divided in two: the upper basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, and the lower basin, California, Arizona, and Nevada. Each basin got an equal share of the river. Walk us through the rationale on that decision and how it might be causing problems as negotiators try to come up with a new way of sharing the resource in this day and age.
100 years later, still, the lower basin uses approximately twice as much water as the upper basin. Still, we're in a situation where the total use in the basin must be reduced. So, of course, you can't increase use in the upper basin if your total net amount you've got to reduce has to be lowered. The lower basin states say to the upper basin, you need to also cut in the upper basin. We're all in this together. The upper basin says, we'll be damned if we're going to cut at all because we only use half of what you do. You should make all the cuts down there. That's sort of where we're at.
It doesn't sound like a good start for a successful negotiation, does it?
It's extremely contentious. In the last 2 years, there have been periods when the upper and lower basin didn't even talk to each other. We have to hope as citizens that behind the scenes, people ultimately realize, no, we're all in this together. We all have to reduce our use, but we're not there yet. Maybe the federal government has to intervene in a stronger way behind the scenes to get the 7 states to say, we're locking the door, we're not letting you out of the room, you guys have to come to agreement. The states strongly resist that. The Colorado River has long been a system in which the states argued that they were in control.
The Colorado River may be divided equally between the two basins, but water rights inside the states are based on seniority. First in time, first in right is the phrase, and farmers were here first. So it should come as no surprise that between 70 and 80% of Colorado River water is used by agriculture. When you start thinking about how this water is utilized, you have to wonder if those sorts of things cannot be addressed in the midst of these negotiations.
You are correct. And that is a very difficult conversation to have. The conversation we don't have that we must have going forward into the future decades is not an upper and lower basin division. It's a conversation about what economic sectors water ought to be used that best positions the United States to maintain, its well-being. And in that sense, you could look at the Colorado River system and say, there's no water crisis at all. You're using more than half the water as livestock feed. You're using 70% totally on agriculture. And you could say, well, does that make sense? Or should we reallocate and use the water to get the most economic return? But that is largely a forbidden topic in these negotiations.
So really the most important discussion is forbidden.
Yes.
Jack, there are a lot of people who say the solution to this really is to make more water, desalination as a solution. Now, that's very expensive water, but maybe there is a solution there, or would you say not?
I think that in selected locations, desalination is an option. But as a systemic solution to the problem, the numbers are just far too big that in the foreseeable future, it's really hard to imagine that there's any solution there, any more than there is a solution in fanciful ideas of building pipelines from the Missouri River or the Great Lakes or down from Canada. Conservation and making agriculture more efficient remain the focus of how we're going to get out of this.
Jack Schmidt, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. It's been great. Thanks for the invitation to talk.
Joining me now is the 24th Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, Camille Kalimlim Tootin. The Bureau she heads manages, right here, the Hoover Dam, the most famous of more than 20 significant dams on the Colorado River and its tributaries. She and Reclamation are right in the middle of these high-stakes negotiations to figure out how to share the river. Thank you so much for joining us, Camille. We really appreciate you flying in for this.
Welcome to Hoover Dam. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to be here. It's a spectacular place. It really is. Let's talk a little bit about the heydays of reclamation, back when they were building dams like crazy. They didn't talk much about conservation in those days. I assume that's a big part of what you're talking about today. What is Reclamation doing these days to eke out as much water as it can from this system?
Well, you started our conversation about where we were almost 2 years ago to the day of Lake Mead hitting the lowest level since filling in 1937. And today, we are 20 feet higher. Part of that is because of record conservation in the Colorado River Basin. We have an agreement of 3 million acre feet, of which we are more than halfway there, to be able to ensure that this lake and this system that 40 million people rely on is stable. And now we can talk about the future.
Some of this had to do with an unusually wet winter, which helped. The conservation that is currently in place, is it enough to get you across the finish line? Surely there has to be more.
When we look at what happened in water year 2023, we were able to save that water as well as use less water. So the lower basin on its own used less water in 40 years. And so it is a combination of doing more with less. And when you do get these rains and snows, to be able to save that as well.
All right, we were talking a little bit earlier about earmarking water for the environment, an idea that which in the early days of reclamation would never have been on the table at all. It's very much a priority now, I hope. We all hope, right? I know that the Biden administration has made this a priority. Tell us a little bit about what Reclamation is doing in that front.
Absolutely. There are so many values in the Colorado River system that we've talked about. The ecosystem is incredibly important. Between Glen Canyon and Hoover Dam is the Grand Canyon. And so we, as part of President Biden's Investing in America agenda, on Monday just announced Bucket 2E, Bucket 2 Ecosystem, where we can invest in projects across the basin that look at bringing that back to life and restoring health within these important watersheds and ecosystems.
It's hard to walk things like that back after all the concrete has been poured and all the water has been diverted, isn't it?
Well, you can be more creative about it, and we have very creative partners.
All right, let's talk about these negotiations. You're right in the middle of them. You're in the room. What's it like being in the room right now? What's the tone of the negotiations?
Well, there is a lot of conversations happening. There are certainly the 7 basin states, there's the 30 sovereign nations, and we also are talking with the country of Mexico. And so what I take as a threshold matter is the people that are in the rooms with me are committed to a path forward and one that we can do together. And I am confident in our relationships and in the track record of this river that we will get there.
We have a viewer question I'd like to throw in the mix here.
Sure.
This one comes from John Teitz in Helena, Montana. The competition between uses of water, agricultural versus domestic, will ultimately necessitate a shift to priority of use, he suggests. How will that shift be accomplished without violating the primary tenets of the compact? First of all, would you accept that that shift is inevitable?
When I've had the opportunity to go across the Colorado River, what my favorite part is being invited into people's homes and what the Colorado River means to them. So when you look at the Yuma and Imperial Valley, it is a strong agricultural community. In the same sense that you can go to the Gila River Indian community and see what those values are to them. I'm from Las Vegas. Lake Mead was in my backyard growing up, and I know what that river means to me. And so as part of our path forward, it's recognizing all of our values in light of climate change and how we go through this together.
All right, you heard Jack Schmidt. He says lock the doors and make them come to an agreement. Have you thought about bringing a padlock to the next meeting?
I like to be able to bring a sense of urgency, but also I know that my team and within the Bureau of Reclamation and all of the people that we talk with are committed to moving as quickly as we can to have a path forward for the future.
By all accounts, they're not very close right now. Would you agree with that?
We are moving in the path we need to move.
All right, we have an election this year, I've heard, and my understanding is that it might be difficult to get anything accomplished in the context of that because some states that are significant might have ruffled feathers. Does this kind of put things on hold until after November?
I'm committed to what we need to do, what's right by the river, is that we need an operating plan by the end of 2026. And we are, when you look at what's at stake, 40 million people, I know that my partners are there with me to be able to do that. And my team here at the Bureau of Reclamation, that some of that you met today, you know, they're committed to this. This is not just a professional mission for us, it's personal. We live in the communities we serve. And so we are 100% committed to doing what's right by the river and finding a path forward.
The management of this river raises all kinds of issues about how our republic is governed. And there was a recent Supreme Court ruling involving the Rio Grande River, where the Supreme Court came down and said, you know, when it comes to interstate agreements, treaties with other nations, the federal government, you know, has a right to be in play there. What about the idea of federalizing the management of the river more? Obviously, this is a federal facility, and there's a lot of that, but the states take ownership over this process. Should the federal government take stronger initiative in order to come up with something that is practical and reasonable for the whole nation?
What I saw from that recent ruling was the surest way to have certainty is to do it together, and that is what I'm committed to.
So do you think the federal government should be doing more, though, be taking more of a forceful position on this and sort of demanding these states come together?
Our track record has always been working with our partners. That hasn't changed in 122 years, and that is what we're committed to doing into the future.
All right. Madam Commissioner, thank you so much.
Thank you for the time. It's great to see you.
Yeah,
and
I'm
have you here.
glad you came. Camille Kamindlam Tootin, we appreciate your time. The Colorado River is spectacular, but compared to other big rivers in this country, it's kind of a lightweight. The flow of this river is a little more than 2% of the Mississippi. The Colorado might be a pipsqueak, but it punches way above its weight. It's one of the most heavily utilized rivers in the world, in the same league as the Ganges, the Yellow, and the Nile. So how is this water used, or perhaps misused, in the arid Southwest? Well, it may not be what you're thinking. When many people think of wasted water in the West, they think of this. The famous fountains at Bellagio on the Strip in Las Vegas. But the fountains and the lake are fed by an aquifer, and it's all recycled, conserving the municipal supply, which is piped in from Lake Mead. And Las Vegas has placed some big bets on water conservation. The city reclaims almost all of its water used indoors. It is treated and then either returned to Lake Mead or used for industry or irrigation of golf courses and public parks. The Southern Nevada Water Authority runs a Cash for Grass program, paying property owners who replace their thirsty lawns with water-efficient landscaping. This program has saved billions of gallons of water by removing millions of square feet of grass. The city strictly enforces watering schedules, encourages drip irrigation systems, fines violators that waste water, and uses smart meters to provide real-time data on usage. Las Vegas is a poster child for thrifty use of municipal water. Many other big cities in the West take a similar approach. In Denver, they run an award-winning campaign to encourage residents to be mindful of water use. They offer rebates for water-efficient appliances, fixtures, and irrigation equipment. They promote smart irrigation controllers, and they have incentives for people to replace traditional lawns with drought-resistant landscaping. The city treats and repurposes wastewater for uses such as irrigation and industrial processes. And Denver Water is testing the waters on a controversial but likely inevitable idea: direct potable reuse, treating wastewaters to a level safe for drinking and then piping it right back into people's homes. Joining me now are two pioneers in the world of water management. Pat Mulroy is the former head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Jim Lochhead ran Denver Water for 13 years. Both have played crucial roles in reshaping the dialogue around water use and conservation in the Colorado River Basin. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we really appreciate you coming in. Let's talk about that idea at the end, which I think is, you probably have had a little more familiarity with, Jim. This idea of treating water and sending it right back home, a round trip. That's a hard one for a lot of people to get used to. Tell me a little bit about those efforts.
It's hard, and it's being done in Southern California on a pretty big scale. It's relatively easy to do when you're on an ocean and you can deal with a discharge of a brine stream. It's really tough in an inland community like Denver, where you have pollutants that are coming out of the water, salt that is coming out of the water. What do you do with it to dispose of it at scale? So it's an idea that we're interested in and testing, but the technology just isn't quite there yet. It's also expensive to our customers.
Yeah, now, so Pat, in your case, you have the advantage of Lake Mead as a way to send that water back and return it, right? Tell me how that works here.
Well, we essentially have a closed loop. We bring the water in from the Colorado River through our treatment plants, deliver it to our customers. Everything they use inside, which goes back to a treatment plant, is treated, and we return it to Lake Mead. For every gallon we put back in Lake Mead, we can take an additional gallon out.
So if the water that's indoors really is in a closed loop, and your goal is to do your best to stop people from washing their cars, essentially. I mean, it comes down to things like that, doesn't it?
It does. The only place we lose water is outside use. So that's why we attacked turf first, because it was the #1 water hog in Southern Nevada. Okay. And people have ripped grass out left and right.
And that was an incentive plan. You did something similar, Jim, as well, when you were running Denver Water. It seems quite literally like kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will. But has that been successful as well?
It has. What we call it is non-functional turf, which is grass you see on center strips, on streetscapes, that the only thing they see is a lawnmower. It's not really even being used. And so we've developed a program based on the Las Vegas program to pay customers to remove that non-functional turf, get it out of our system, and what we call Colorado-scape the landscape and make it more appropriate to the environment that we live in.
So lawns are a big deal, aren't they? They really take up a lot of water, don't they?
They do. Most outside. When I moved to Las Vegas, and next month it'll be 50 years for me living here.
You came as a baby, obviously, right? Yeah.
No, I was a little older than that. Everyone had tropical landscaping. They were growing Bermuda grass, Kentucky bluegrass. We were growing oleanders and, you know, everything that you want to find in Florida and in the tropics. That was what Las Vegas had, and all that has changed.
What percentage represents lawn watering, that kind of irrigation, Jim? Do you know offhand?
During the irrigation season, it's about 50%.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's a big deal when you start getting the lawns out. All right, we have a question for one of our viewers. This comes from Mike Maxwell, Las Vegas, Nevada. We've known for decades that water was becoming more scarce in the West, and now we know climate change will only make matters worse. How then is it at all defensible that there are still dramatic population growth in cities like Las Vegas, for example, when water supplies continue to dwindle? How do local governments justify massive new development of residential homes and industrial sites?
The question isn't whether you grow, the question is how you grow. I mean, in Southern Nevada, we are using less water today. We're down to what, about 220, 230,000 acre feet a year. And when we started, we were at 360. So, and we have increased the population by 500,000 people. So it's how the individual uses that water. How water-wise can they be? And can we take that water drop and stretch it and make it more usable by more people and more industries?
It seems like the math doesn't add up, Jim, when you talk about that kind of growth and that kind of reduction in water use.
Happens all over the West. Yeah.
The answer is in density.
Yeah.
We have to grow more densely. We have to avoid sprawl growth of large lot subdivisions that have large amounts of irrigation. We need to live more efficiently. And that makes sense not just from a water standpoint, but from a transportation standpoint, from an energy standpoint, across the board. Responding to a changing climate is going to require better land use and a better relationship between land use and the natural resources that we depend upon.
Now, the overall cut that I think everybody's trying to achieve, no one knows exactly how it's going to be divvied out, is about 20%, as I understand it. Is conservation alone going to get us there?
Across the...
Yeah.
Mathematically, you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, who does it and who carries the burden, and does everybody carry the same level of burden? How is it rolled out? It's not that it's impossible to do. It's the issue is who does it.
Well, would you
That's
agree?
the essence of the negotiations
Yeah.
between the 7 states. Overuse over the last 25 years has been about 20%. So you need to figure out who is going to make those cuts of 20%. The states have had an opportunity to reach a comprehensive agreement about how not only they're going to reduce those demands, but how they can weave that into environmental protection, and how they can do it comprehensively, building resilience in the system, and how they can fund it. And that challenge is still in front of them, as we've heard previously.
So, Pat, is it time to think long and hard about making water, desalination?
Absolutely.
In the Middle East, that's a big deal, obviously.
Absolutely. And it's, look, I've always said you can't just have one arrow in your quiver. One of the foundational notions for climate change for water managers is that you have to have some level of diversity. It's not going to be the silver bullet, but will it be one of the mosaic pieces that can help manage the river system? I'm absolutely convinced it can be.
Well, Jim, I know there are desal plants in San Diego, Australia. You pick a lot of places that are mothballed because the water turns out to be so expensive it's not worth turning them on. Is Pat onto something here or not?
It's something that needs to continue to be explored, and it needs to come at the right time. It's a huge capital investment. It's a huge operating cost, and there are these plants throughout the world that have been built and then aren't being used for large periods of time and are just sitting there. So it needs to be very carefully brought into the palette of options that are available to municipalities.
The big mistake they made in Sydney in Australia is they planned the desalter to only be used during drought periods, rather than making the desalter part of the base load and allowing the fresh water that then comes back to be used environmentally. I mean, it was like an upside-down thinking process.
Well, maybe that technology has progressed, potentially.
The technology has progressed, and the key is going to be finding energy sources for this desal that don't add dramatically to the carbon footprint, because we've got to be able to manage that as well.
Let's shift a moment to the negotiations. You both have been in the rooms when these talks occur.
Since '94, we've been at it.
And, you know, we got the upper basin, lower basin. You can do a little mud wrestle if you want, whatever. But here's the question. I think it's worth, for a national audience, to explain the fundamental difference here. Jim, there are people in the upper basin, in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, that deal with water shortages almost routinely. The advantage, of course, down here is you have these two giant reservoirs to kind of cushion the blow. How much does that factor into what the upper basin states are saying at the negotiation table right now?
It's at the heart of what the upper basin states are saying. Because of the fact that upper basin water users are dependent on hydrology, because they take shortages every year, because they don't have the benefit of the bank account of these storage reservoirs that's been drawn down by the lower basin states, the upper basin states are saying that the lower basin, first of all, needs to take shortages first and maybe take all of the shortages. And there's not really a discussion about kind of an all-in approach about who takes what cuts and when, but having a basin-wide solution available to everybody. And that's, at the end of the day, when we were arguing back and forth between Las Vegas and Colorado, and between Lower Basin, Upper Basin in 2007 and before, we built relationships. We came to understanding about the needs of each of our constituents, and we tried to build solutions that would address all of those things.
So from a lower basin perspective, first of all, that idea of compromise, would you agree that's the way it worked in those days?
Oh, absolutely. There wouldn't have been an interim surplus, an interim shortage. None of that would have happened. Those first years were critical. And I know you're going to have Bruce Babbitt on later. I have to give him a lot of credit for it. I mean, he was the right person in the right seat at the right time. And from the lower basin perspective, the lower basin is saying, look, this is a basin-wide problem. The upper basin needs to come to the table. The magic is going to be how and when does the upper basin come to the table, and how does that play out?
So, Jim, the lower basin has agreed to significant cuts, and correct me if I'm wrong, is agreeing to split further cuts that might materialize down the road. Is that an untenable position, or is that a reasonable compromise, you think?
Well, the cuts that the lower basin have agreed to take are incredibly significant, and the lower basin has already implemented a number of cuts. Their total water use has gone down from 7.5 million acre feet to 5.8 million acre feet. As Pat said, the question is, when does the upper basin step to the table? It may not be a 50-50 sharing arrangement past 1.5 million acre feet. It may be something else, but they at least need to start talking about it. And right now, at this point in time, there's just an exchange of legal positions.
So it seems as if, in addition to a scarcity of water, there's a scarcity of statesmanship here. And why is that, do you think?
Pat mentioned Secretary Babbitt. The federal government has played a leadership role historically in the successes that we've had in the past. The federal government is undergoing an environmental impact statement process right now to look at operational guidelines that will be developed by the end of 2026. And the federal government can use that leverage to bring the states together to reach agreement with the not too subtle threat that if the states don't come to an agreement, the federal government will do something, because the federal government has to do something.
My understanding is out here that's the last thing people want, the federal government coming in and making those decisions, right,
That's
Pat?
particularly an issue in the upper basin.
Right.
I mean, there it is states' rights. I mean, we down here in the lower basin, we're all federal contractors. I mean, in order to use water in the lower basin, you have to have a contract with the federal government. So the Southern Nevada Water Authority has a contract with Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation. CAP has one. Metropolitan has one. IID has one. In the upper basin, that is not the case. It is totally state-controlled.
Okay, so the clock is ticking. The negotiating positions seem to be very far apart. A couple of veteran water buffaloes retired here. Weigh in now, if you would, and give some sage advice. What would you say to make these negotiations get off dead center? Jim, you first.
You asked the question about locking them in a room. I would lock them in a room. And I think that the process needs to also have further outreach. And then I think also be put on the table is not just how Lake Mead and Lake Powell operate, but a comprehensive solution of environmental protection and long-term sustainable funding to put these tools in place to bring the system into balance.
Pat, it sounds like an awfully big deal over an awfully long period of time. Can you make it happen?
It can happen much quicker. And we were laughing off camera before we came on. That's exactly what we did to get to the 2007 agreement. I wouldn't let anybody go eat dinner until we came to a certain point in the negotiations. And at some point, you just have to do it. My best advice to them is get to know your neighbor. Get to understand where they're coming from on their level. It's not just about you, it's about everybody, but you can't find a solution if the solution only benefits you.
All right, you guys look tanned, rested, and ready. Why don't you suit up and get in?
Listen, give us a couple of hours, we'll fix it.
All right. Thank you so much, Pat Mulroy, Jim Lochhead. When asked why he robbed banks, the notorious bank robber Willie Sutton quit because that's where the money is. So where is the water in the Colorado River Basin? We've established it's not in Las Vegas or Denver. Around here, the water is down on the farm.
Here's something to think about next winter when you're grazing at the salad bar. The lettuce you will eat is about 90 to 95% water, and that water most likely will come from the Colorado River. 90% of the leafy vegetables consumed in the U.S. from November to March are grown here in the Imperial Valley of California and Yuma, Arizona. There's about 700,000 acres of farmland here, a man-made agricultural oasis. The soil here is exceptionally fertile, enriched by thousands of years of alluvial deposits containing fine silt, clay, and organic material from the Colorado River. There is, of course, plenty of sunshine and heat for a year-round growing season, and much of this land is below sea level. There's about 300 feet of elevation difference between the river and the valley. So in 1901, when early European settlers dug the first canal, gravity did the rest. Voila, a desert transformed. Just add water. With water rights that go back that far, the Imperial Irrigation District has ultimate seniority. Remember, first in time, first in right. As a result, farmers here hold the largest single allocation of Colorado River water, more than 10 trillion gallons per year. That is 70% of California's total share of the river.
We are joined now by J.B. Hamby, who grew up in a farming family in the Imperial Valley. He became the head of the Imperial Irrigation District and is now the chairman of the state's Colorado River Board. He is California's lead representative in all interstate and federal matters regarding the river, including the current negotiations. J.B., welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk about these negotiations, but first, let's talk a little bit about the Imperial Valley, your roots. Tell me a little bit about what's produced there. We talked about the produce, but there's a lot of alfalfa as well, and that could be a controversial subject because it's relatively thirsty, and pretty good, sizable proportion of it gets exported to places like Saudi Arabia. How much alfalfa is grown there? How much of it gets exported?
So the Imperial Valley irrigates about 450,000 acres, which is a tremendous volume of land that uses a little bit of water. And of that, we have a tremendous amount of vegetables and other fruits that are grown in the Imperial Valley. And a substantial component also is some forage crops that are used mostly domestically within our state for the dairying industry, and makes its way around the world as well as part of a global market that our farmers participate in.
Yeah, that is a sticking point, I think, with our audience. They have issues with it. Bart Anderson is in Bullhead City, Arizona. He says, why do we allow foreign countries to use our precious water to grow alfalfa in the desert to ship back to their country? How do farmers in the Imperial Valley defend this?
So our farmers grow whatever the market supports, and the market supports whatever the demands of consumers are. So if folks have an issue with alfalfa, that's really an issue with milk or ice cream or pizza cheese or hamburgers or even alfalfa sprouts at that too.
But alfalfa can be grown in a lot of places, not just in Imperial Valley.
It's particularly well suited in Southern California. Our farmers have been growing since the beginning of our agricultural origins. It supports those industries, and we get 12 plus cuttings a year in the Imperial Valley, as opposed to other places within the basin that are a fraction of that.
All right, you have senior rights, and I think we can say with relative certainty that taps will not go dry in Los Angeles or Las Vegas because there are farmers growing alfalfa in the Imperial Valley. We know that. So the writing is on the wall there in some sense, isn't it?
So I think what we see as a state in California, all of our users, including the Imperial Valley and the major urban centers throughout the lower basin, have recognized there's a need to come to an agreement on what the long-term future of the Colorado River looks like. Trying to justify each other's uses or argue legal interpretations until we're blue in the face doesn't really work very well. So that's what led us to come up with this landmark. First of all, a couple of years ago in this very room, Lower Basin planned to generate 3 million acre-feet of water by the term of the end of these guidelines, and then coming up with a new plan to reduce our uses in the Lower Basin, and then with the participation of Mexico as well. to reduce uses by 1.5 million acre-feet a year. This bathtub ring that we're seeing behind us, that's the visible evidence of a structural deficit where uses have exceeded available supply. And so what our plan does is resolves that deficit and starts to rebuild storage so we have a more resilient reservoir and river system.
What are farmers in the Imperial Valley doing to conserve?
So right now, in addition to existing conservation programs that keep California whole and within our 4.4 million acre foot right as a state that has made water available to other urban uses within our state, farmers in the Imperial Valley have been engaging in large-scale conservation programs, going above and beyond those conservation requirements, making that water available to stay here in Lake Mead. And then on top of that, on top of those existing substantial programs generating 500,000 acre-feet a year, the Imperial Irrigation District is working in partnership with the Bureau of Reclamation to develop a deficit irrigation program to idle some of those summer forage crops and leave that water here for the duration of these current guidelines to help protect the system.
All right, I'm going to ask you to take your IID hat off for a moment now, put on your state negotiator hat. You've been in the room with these negotiations, and I know it's had some pretty rough moments along the way. First of all, just what's it been like being in these negotiations? Have they been as rough as it seems?
Well, it comes and goes at different points. Certainly for my first couple of meetings in this particular role, we were at a very different position. The reservoir, which is gained a little bit in elevation over the past couple of years as a result of substantial efforts that have taken place. It was a very different situation at that time. Particularly then, you had the other 6 Colorado River Basin states focused on California, and so that was a very difficult time. Ultimately, what we were able to do in California, Nevada, and Arizona is come up with this tremendous 3 million acre-feet of conservation to leave behind in the system here, and with the added additions of water being generated by Mexico, and in partnership with the Bureau of Reclamation, we've been able to improve our relationships, improve the health of the system, and better position ourselves as a bridge to the future.
You agreed to a 10% cut for your state. Was that a difficult thing to sell to the home folks?
Look, we have a need to make massive reductions to be able to address this long-term challenge we've seen exacerbated by climate change. So we looked at that number, 1.5 million acre-feet. We were able to understand the solution at a high level, but then we obviously have to come down to who's going to take what. And that took a lot of conversations between Arizona and California, 2 states that have historically had very different views and perspectives about their respective rights and paths forward on the Colorado River. But we were able to come to that understanding about how we should manage within that 1.5 million acre-foot reduction. It's something that's necessary, and it's something we're going to get done.
I suppose if Arizona and California can come to an agreement, maybe the whole basin can?
I'd like to think so, and I think it's a really encouraging sign.
Okay. What about the role of the federal government in this negotiation? We've heard a lot of talk about how a strong, forceful federal presence is important. Would you agree?
I think so, and we've been very delighted with this administration's role in this process.
So you don't see any problems on that front? I mean, would you suggest maybe an outside mediator, for example?
It's been something that's been used over time, but at this point, the states have been very much interested in working together and try to sort things out. Okay. Sometimes slower than we'd like.
What about lowering the bar a little bit and trying for an agreement that isn't quite as long, maybe a 5-year agreement? Is that something that has gotten any traction?
I think it's good to consider turning all the knobs and levers and see what works to make people more comfortable to commit to the substantial adaptation that needs to be made to handle the future of climate change.
So I assume the risk of litigation is always present, and in a sense, that's probably the worst outcome that everybody could imagine, I suppose. Does that ultimately potentially lead to the states sort of losing control of the river?
Instead of 7 states being able to work out something that we make sense and throwing it instead to 9 justices in black robes in Washington, D.C., that's really abrogating our role to make a decision that makes sense for all of us and our users and citizens within our states. So it's in our best interest to work something out and make those necessary compromises so we don't have a court ruling handed down that nobody's happy with.
J.B. Hamby, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Urban areas are often willing to pay a premium for water, providing economic incentives for agriculture users to transfer their water rights. These financial incentives can be significant, making it an attractive option for some farmers and some Native American tribes. I sat down with Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona to talk about that and to gauge his optimism on the state of the current negotiations.
Thank you very much for joining us, Senator Kelly. Whiskey is for drinking, water for fighting. That's the old expression. Is there some reality to that in this day and age?
Well, my experience over 3.5 years in the U.S. Senate on this issue, as you know, for other issues, it's also for collaborating. And we've had a lot of success here in the Senate in the time I've been here, providing a lot of resources for both lower basin and upper basin states to really build some conservation into the system level efficiencies. So we've done a lot of collaboration on this issue.
The upper basin doesn't even use its full allocation and seems to be taking a pretty hard position on that. Is that a danger sign for the outcome of these negotiations?
Well, I think ultimately, it's in everybody's best interest to come to an agreement between the upper and lower basin. We know that we have to work together and everybody's going to have to compromise. Water rights do matter. That's built into the lower basin proposal. The upper basin has, their ideas about how we have to conserve water if the levels in Lake Powell and Lake Mead were to go down. Just got to figure out how we're going to meet in the middle, and I think ultimately we will. You don't want this to get into federal court and have somebody else who lives somewhere else, dictating how this is going to go. So I'm optimistic about it.
Is there enough to guarantee water for everybody and continue the growth and everything else?
There's clearly enough water. There's enough water to grow our food. There's enough water to grow the economy, for business to come, not just to our state, but other upper and lower basin states. Clearly enough. We just got to be more careful with it. So this becomes a collaboration between industry, cities, tribes, state-to-state collaboration, the federal government. 2 big pieces of legislation we passed provided billions of dollars in resources to be able to be deployed to just do more with a little less water. You mentioned this drought, and in the last 2 years, we've seen the level in Lake Mead go up by about 20 feet. It's a lot of water. Some of this is because we've had a couple wet winters, but a portion of this increase is because of the conservation efforts we've taken. And then, as we go forward here, if you add in more recycling of water, if we take those steps, there's going to be plenty of water for everybody.
There is a lot of evidence that urban centers are doing this and have done a good job at conservation, in spite of the fact that Phoenix continues to grow. Water consumption actually
has gone down.
It goes down. It's extraordinary, right?
It's gone down since the 1950s. It's gone down substantially.
But then
and get this, with a lot more people, millions of more people.
So that's quite a success story.
Yep.
But when you look at the agricultural sector, which is 80% of the water usage system-wide, you see a lot of people in your state, a lot of farmers, still planting things like alfalfa, which are thirsty crops that are used for cattle feed. Is that where you see the possibility of making some serious dents, some serious improvement?
Yeah, there are possibilities for change. There are crops where they can earn as good of a living as a farmer using less water. When somebody has been farming a certain crop for generations, it's not easy for them to look at another crop and then convert their entire operation. But I do know that farmers are doing that.
Is it inevitable then that agricultural water will, over time, sort of be transferred to the urban environment?
Well, I think we can do both. I think all of the above is an option. We can't live with the status quo. It was getting at a level where there were going to be some mandatory, cuts involved, and we felt the better way to do this was to get the conservation we get from, having direct negotiations with farmers. That helped stabilize the level in Lake Mead, and while we're stabilizing the level, we're starting these other programs that take additional time. Building infrastructure takes time. You just don't snap your fingers and the stuff is all in place, and then the level of water in Lake Powell and Lake Mead start to go up. The tribes often come up with great ideas on how to conserve water. The Gila River Indian community, they're starting to implement one of these ideas, which is to cover their water canals with solar panels. So you get energy, but you also prevent evaporation or reduce evaporation significantly.
In April, Arizona's Colorado River Indian Tribes, or CRIT, signed a historic agreement that grants them the right to lease a portion of their Colorado River water allocations to off-reservation users. The CRIT Water Resiliency Act, passed in 2022, allows the tribes to lease, exchange, or store their water entitlements, helping the state manage and conserve its diminished water resources.
With their ability to now lease water to, other entities in Arizona, they now have money that they can use to line those canals. You line them with cement, you don't get the leakage anymore. You have more water. Ultimately, you can lease some more of that out, get even more resources. So we get ideas from all corners of the state, including tribes, and when we implement these, we save water. And it's just a matter of continuing to do that.
Is there enough water to protect the environment, too, with the press of population, climate, the drought, and everything else?
Yeah, I think ultimately, if we make good decisions, if we have everybody at the table, we negotiate, in a good way between, the upper and lower basin states, I think we could have a, situation where for decades to come, we will have enough water in the West. We're all going to have to, figure out how to do more with a little bit less, but with these conservation efforts we put into place, and with new infrastructure and new recycling, I think the amount that people are going to have to ultimately, cut back is somewhat mitigated.
So it doesn't seem as grim.
I don't think
excuse
it's
me.
grim.
It isn't as grim as it seems. I should say.
Miles, you know me. I'm an optimist. You have to be when you're the guy flying the spaceship built by the lowest bidder. You got to be an optimist. But I think in this case, this situation, with water in the West, we've got the tools in place. We've got good efforts by the tribes and cities and industry. The upper and lower basin states are still talking about this. We've got a disagreement, but I think ultimately we're going to figure out how to meet in the middle here.
Do you think a water war is brewing here?
No, I think what's brewing is ultimately an agreement between Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, California, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. That's what I hope to get to, and I think we will get there.
Thank you very much, Senator.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
So is there really an agreement brewing, as the senator suggests? And if so, is this an opportunity to address a pressing need, the lack of safe and reliable drinking water on Indian land? Joining me now to discuss this is Heather Tanana. She is a visiting professor at the University of California, Irvine Law School, and she's also an associate faculty member at the Center for Indigenous Health at the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health, and she is a member of the Navajo Nation. Heather, thank you for being here with us.
Glad to be here.
So let's lay out the problem here. When we say there's no drinking water, this is something, of course, we all take for granted, most of us. But on Navajo land, it's something that is actually very rare.
Right. Water insecurity is pervasive for many tribal communities, certainly in the Colorado River Basin, but also across the United States broadly. And it's really rooted in past federal policies and, quite frankly, broken promises.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that. And I know you and your family have had a direct connection to this. Essentially, there was a long-term effort to assimilate the tribes. Tell us how that impacts water ultimately.
Yeah, so back, going to late 1800s, early 1900s, the federal government very aggressively pursued allotment and assimilation policies. An allotment meaning dividing up tribal lands into individual ownership, and assimilation basically purging any Native identity, culture, values, and to bring Native Americans into mainstream society. And let's not kid about it, there were no altruistic motives behind that. It was to grab the land, to open it up to white settlers. And the boarding school era was one of those efforts where children were removed from their families. My own father was removed from his family. If you talk to anyone, honestly, who's Native American, they probably have been impacted by that legacy. And I'm only here because my father survived boarding school. So basically, Native Americans weren't expected to be here today, to have Native futures. And so this lack of investment in their communities, lack of water, as atrocious as it is, as morally reprehensible, it's not that surprising, unfortunately.
Long past due to right this wrong, clearly. Some of this has to do with just money to do infrastructure, and that's been a challenge, hasn't it?
Yeah, the federal government invested in other communities, in Phoenix, in Las Vegas, all throughout the West. But tribal communities were overlooked. And again, that's notwithstanding these federal treaty trust responsibilities that the government should be upholding.
So, and the Supreme Court, it's been a long ruling now, it's been a long time, has ruled that Native American tribes have water rights, but it's not specified. And the devil is always in the details. In this case, those rights really haven't amounted to much, have they? How can that be changed?
Well, since 1908, that's the decision you're referencing, the Winters Doctrine confirmed that tribes have water rights. Now, going about quantifying that can be difficult. And there's been strides to do that. In fact, Senator Kelly introduced a bill that would authorize the Northern Arizona water settlement and help facilitate water access for Hopi Tribe, Navajo Nation, San Juan, Southern Paiute. And those settlements are important because they often can include big infrastructure projects to bring in that water. But there are still many outstanding claims that tribes in the basin have. And, I was looking at this map earlier. We have the border with Mexico, the states, but none of the tribal lands are identified. And tribes have very significant rights, and there's still some that are outstanding.
Well, give us a sense, try to help us understand the challenge of getting running water to a place like Navajo country.
Yeah, it can be difficult given the terrain, but there's been research out there that has shown it's not the rural location, it's not the socioeconomic status that determines whether you have water access in the U.S., it's your race. And Native American families are 19 times more likely than white families to lack that running water. And again, this is systemic racism that's been built into policies in our country that we have to fight back against, that we have to elevate tribal leadership and tribal voices. And we're getting there. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, huge investment by Congress to fulfill those federal responsibilities, but there's still some challenges.
Is that idea of leasing water rights to urban centers, for example, does that have some traction, and does that seem like a viable solution?
Well, certainly we've seen tribes like Gila River Indian Community, Colorado River Indian tribes who are engaging in different strategies with their water rights. They're fortunate that they have their water rights quantified and they can do that. That's not a given for every tribe, though. The federal government holds water rights, it holds their land in trust for tribes and for their benefit. And so there needs to be some authorization and approval by federal government to really exercise all those rights. But it's certainly something that we should be considering. It's something that some tribes are already doing. It's one of those tools that we can look at.
Could it fund some of this infrastructure, potentially?
Oh, absolutely.
So the tribes were not at the table in 1922 for the famous or infamous Colorado River Compact. And clearly that's just what you were talking about, this historical racism. At this stage of the game, with reaching the limits of the river in many respects, you would think this would be a bad time to try to say, hey, what about us? But in a way, is there an opportunity for the tribes to get a proper seat at the table? And do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I think the dialogue has really changed in the last 5 years, especially. Tribes, they're rebuilding that capacity. Yes, they lost a lot of future leaders from the boarding school era, from other actions by the government. But if you look at tribal leadership today, a lot of women, Indigenous women, are driving water governance, water decision-making. We have scientists like Dr. Carletta Chief and Dr. Tolu Cordova who are informing and helping their tribe make these really important decisions. They're stepping up and claiming those roles whether or not people want them to.
The fact that the Interior Secretary is a Native American, I assume that has something to do with this.
Well, I think it shows that she understands the issues. She doesn't need to get caught up to speed. She knows the challenges on the ground that a lot of Native communities are facing, and that's a first, and I think it does make a difference.
Heather Tanana, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. From its headwaters in the Rocky Mountains, through the Grand Canyon, to its delta at the Sea of Cortez, the Colorado River endures an environmental onslaught. In all, there are about 100 dams enabling 40 million people to live in this part of the world. But of course, it also drastically changes the natural river. There's no turning back on the dams now, of course. Too many humans depend on them. But there are ways to recreate some aspects of what nature intends.
In Colorado and Wyoming, researchers, nonprofits, and the Bureau of Land Management are leaving it to beavers. They're working to reintroduce them to land where they were considered pests and routinely eradicated. The dams that they build so eagerly capture and retain precious water by design. They create lush vegetation and diverse habitats in areas still scarred by wildfires. Beaver dams also slow down water flow, which allows sediments to settle out of the water, improving water clarity and quality. And the dams recharge groundwater supplies. This helps maintain stream flows during dry periods, supporting ecosystems and water supplies downstream. Downstream, the Glen Canyon Dam creates all kinds of adverse impacts to the river environment. Water is released here to satisfy the needs of electrical generation and the obligations of the sharing agreement between the upper and lower basin states. This erases the natural flow of the river. The dam also traps a huge amount of sediment that would naturally flow downstream, creating sandbars and beaches in the Grand Canyon. Nutrients essential for downstream ecosystems are also trapped behind the dam. All of this destroys habitat that sustains native, sometimes endangered species. One solution: adaptive management, meaning water is periodically released in ways that carry sediment and nutrients. High-flow experiments have been conducted in recent years with some success. The river delta is perhaps the greatest environmental catastrophe created by putting too many straws in the Colorado. Once an extraordinary wetland filled with marshes and lagoons, it was home to numerous species of birds, fish, mammals, and reptiles. It served as a crucial stopover for migratory birds along the so-called Pacific Flyway. But since the 1980s, the Colorado River has rarely reached the Sea of Cortez, leaving the delta bone dry. In the past decade, however, Mexico and the U.S. have collaborated to release short pulses of water to revive a portion of the delta. It's a Band-Aid, but it's working.
Let's talk a little bit more about the river and the environment. For that, we are joined by Karen Kwan, who is an Associate Project Director at the Colorado River Sustainability Campaign. Karen is a lawyer who has a remarkable grasp on the complex world of water law. When I talk to her, I sometimes think I understand it almost. So thank you, Karen, for being here. Let's get right to a viewer question.
Great.
Gets right to the point. Harold Miller of Colorado Springs asked this. Under the Colorado River Compact of 1922 and Western water law, no water was reserved for aquatic life and the ecosystem of birds and plants. What can be done to cure those errors?
It's a great question. I think, as many of people before me have talked about today, that the values of our our communities have changed from the 1920s to now, and we recognize that we're tied to the river more than we maybe thought we were in 1920s. And what we can do now is recognize how to incorporate those values into the operations. We're not in a situation of just solving the math problem anymore. It is a math problem, but solving the math problem doesn't necessarily guarantee the functionality of the river that we all depend on. So we need to factor in stewardship and mitigation into our operations.
How much of it is press releases and how much of it is real at this point?
There's no one indicator in this complex system that we all depend on that will show whether we're going to be at the brink of catastrophe for the ecosystem and the environment. But we have a lot of alarms sounding, whether we point to the Delta and what, if we overlook things, what could happen. We could point to the Salton Sea and recognize that even in our good intent of trying to be better stewards and conserve water, it has environmental effects, public health hazards that we need to now go back and manage. The Grand Canyon, if we don't think about how to operate Glen Canyon Dam, we risk sacrificing the environment in the Grand Canyon. So we have alarms. We have alarms. Catastrophic wildfires have been happening more frequently in California and Colorado, Utah. So all of those kind of things, we're at the brink. I think we need to start listening.
You know, it's very difficult to imagine how you get anywhere close to what this natural river was like. I mean, we know that's not going to happen.
Right.
So how do you sort of pick what to go after, what's practical? How much of the environment can be restored? I know that's a tough question.
It is a tough question, and I think depending on where you ask and who you ask, the answer might be a little bit different. But I think at a baseline level, we need to maintain the functionality of the system, the actual living natural systems that sustain us all, including the birds and the fish and the wildlife that call Colorado River their home as well. And so I think we need to really start focusing on making sure we have, for example, healthy forests that will sustain our headwaters that feed the entire system. We need to preserve and restore some of the wetlands so that we can make sure our groundwater systems and our soils can still continue to operate and provide the economic benefit that we're all looking for. I think there's, the connectivity of the river itself. If we have no water in the system, if there's no water running through the Grand Canyon, we have a huge environmental disaster. Those are low-hanging fruit things that I think we should factor into our management going forward.
So is the environment finally at the table in a meaningful way, you think?
It depends. The table is a little bit of a misnomer right now. We don't know where the table is. It moves around a lot. So I think the environment is being factored in the conversation. Where it lands is a whole nother story. Thanks to, as just Commissioner Touton just identified, we have this Upper Basin Bucket 2 ecosystem funding. That is a big deal, and we are very grateful to have that be injected into the conversation. But are we at the table? Is the environment at the table? I think every individual and leader, state representative can factor in the environment in their equation and the formula, and that's what needs to happen.
Well, there is water occasionally going into the Delta, and that was an unprecedented moment where water got actually allocated for the environment, right? So is there a turn here?
There can be. There have been examples of it, and I think the environmental conservation groups were a big factor in that play. It was a long conversation and negotiation in and of itself, but there was an appeal between the United States and Mexico, the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin, and the conservation groups to find a way to conserve water that could then be a pulse flow to the sea. And it's showing that with creativity and cooperation, we can restore things.
Well, you see the bathtub rings here. It's a diminishing resource, and it's a fractious negotiation. Mm-hmm. How optimistic are you that the environment can still get its seat at the table in the midst of this fight over something that is becoming more and more scarce?
I'm an optimistic heart, so I am a little bit optimistic. I think that the alternative is so devastatingly to the environment that we have to try and we have to get at the table and make sure and remind people that it is in their best interest to work to preserve the systems that they depend on for all of our economies, our societies, our cultures going forward. I am optimistic because we have the relationships with the right people to be able to factor that in, and it's all in our interest.
I was talking to Heather right before you came up. Connect the environment to the tribal interests, because there is kind of a relationship there, isn't
Oh, there's a huge relation. I think we learn from the tribes how to value the environment better, how to factor it into our lifestyles, how to revere it in some ways. I think I will definitely not ever be able to speak for tribes, but to learn from them of how water is life. The Colorado River is the lifeblood for them. Different people have different ways of looking at it, but revering the environment and recognizing how it fills into the society and the way we live is not a bad thing to remember.
Just give us a couple of words here. Give us a little poetry on the Colorado River. The intrinsic value of this place, it's stunning. We all of us in this nation own a piece of the beauty here, and it should be a part of the discussion, shouldn't it?
It should be. I think, I'm a native of this basin, I'm native, not indigenous native, but of this basin. I think all of us are very passionate about where we live and what it means to us. And I hearken back to the movie River Runs Through It, and it's like I'm haunted by waters because they permeate everything that we do here.
Karen Kwan, thank you very much. We're going to ask you to stay here and help us field some questions in just a moment, but we're going to turn to one other person, a special guest right now. As governor of Arizona and the only Interior Secretary to serve in the Clinton administration, Bruce Babbitt has long been a strong advocate for finding a way to manage and utilize the Colorado River sustainably. I sat down with him recently in Washington. Governor, thank you so much for taking the time. Who owns the Colorado River?
The United States of America owns the Colorado River. But the answer is not that simple. We are in a federal system in which the states take the position that they own the underlying rights and they are allocated out according to state law. And that all worked fine when there was enough water. The states are now at each other's throats saying, hey, we got to recarve this pie, but they can't agree on how to do it, and we've got the makings of a genuine water war.
A water war?
That phrase is tossed around a lot, but this one is real because the impasse is going to lead into a real dilemma where who's going to decide who gets how much water.
Is there any question that some entity or multiple entities are going to have to live with less water?
Well, of course, that's the underlying fact. We are using about 20% more water than the river is delivering on the average. The reservoirs are going dry. We've got to find a way to reduce water deliveries somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% on the best assumptions that the scientists can make. And the question is, whose ox is gored? Who is going to get cut? And in the absence of rules as they expire, you can see it's going to be Armageddon on the river.
It sounds like anarchy a little bit.
Yeah, anarchy is a better description because nobody wants to give up their water, and everybody is going to suffer to some degree. And we haven't been able to rise to the occasion because for 100 years we've been operating on false assumptions about how much water there is, and when there's a lot of water, it's easy to compromise disputes as they come up. That time is over.
Does a strict seniority system work in a world with diminishing water and increasing demand?
Well, more than half of the Colorado River water that belongs to Arizona is growing alfalfa down in the desert. Phoenix is way down the line because the population didn't start to really boom until the last 50 years. So Phoenix is looking up all of those vast fields of alfalfa saying, is this really a good way to allocate water? Farmers are saying, sorry, we were here first. Tough luck.
There must be a way to cajole or convince farmers perhaps to plant less thirsty crops, or come up with ways to compensate them for using less. Is that kind of a third rail issue in your part of the world?
Well, it's a third rail issue, but inevitably there's going to have to be some reallocation and readjustment. I mean, the idea of an equitable allocation of water can't be based on what happened 100 years ago. And 5 million voters in Phoenix are ultimately going to say, third rail or not, we determine how water is allocated in Arizona. It's been an untouchable subject so far, but that's going to change. There has to be a readjustment, a reallocation between agriculture and the growing urban areas.
Is that inevitable, you think? One way or another, water is going to shift from agriculture to urban?
It's inevitable. The question is, how long is it going to take? How painful is the process going to be? And what do you do about the economics in the agricultural community of making this move and providing a compensation system in which agriculture farmers are fairly compensated? Los Angeles has begun already to write checks to the farmers in Imperial Valley, striking deals, paying big prices. Look, 20 million people in Los Angeles can afford to pay a substantial price.
What sort of responsibility does the Interior Department and the federal government have to ensure this negotiation leads to a reasonable outcome?
The Interior Department and the administration behind the Interior Department are staying out of this. They're sitting on the bench, and it's prolonging the dispute because the 7 states are saying, we don't want the federal government, that's what they say in public, but in negotiating in private, the 7 states are all saying, we're beginning to realize we're headed off the cliff until the Interior Department gets into the game.
Governor, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it. I'm joined once again by John Fleck and Karen Kwan for our lightning round of questions from our viewers. Let's start with a video question. Let's roll that one right now.
Hi, my name is John Bergen, and I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and I had a question about the Basin State proposals that the Upper and Lower Basin States are currently negotiating. I was curious to hear if there are parts of those proposals that the Basin States would be willing to compromise on, and relatedly, are there parts of those proposals that the Basin States would be unwilling to compromise on? Thanks.
All right, who wants to take it?
I think the answer to that question is yes.
Next question.
I think that they're coming to a table, and as Commissioner Tootin identified, is there's a commitment and a willingness to try to find this solution. I don't think people are wasting their time trying to pretend that they're not going to come to a solution. Whether they can or can't remains to be seen, and so we'll go from there.
The reality is that the compromise that needs to happen, which is big water use reductions in the lower basin and eventually some contribution from the upper basin. So far, the upper basin has been unwilling to acknowledge a need to that. The reality is that's where we're going to end up. And we're going to end up there whether it's through a negotiated agreement or some sort of a solution imposed by the federal government or imposed by a court. But we're not going to simply drain Phoenix and Los Angeles and the Imperial Valley while those of us who live in the upper basin do nothing.
Okay, so this one comes from Genetic Memory Farms on YouTube. Why do we not move fruit and vegetable production out of arid parts of the U.S. and bring it east where we have most of the population and plenty of water?
These happen to be really great places to grow the crops that they grow there. Yuma and Imperial are fabulous places to grow lettuce in the wintertime. And it's a relatively small fraction of the total agricultural water use. We're not talking about that being the core of our agricultural production. We should do that in a place that's good for that. We will end up growing less of the alfalfa and the forage crops to feed our cattle there.
Next one comes from Michael Swanson on Facebook. Is global warming responsible for this problem? Would switching to solar or wind energy help solve this problem? Another person asks if it might be better if we ate less meat.
I would say that global warming or climate change, or we refer to it as millennial droughts, whatever you want to call it, yes, the hydrology has changed in the last 20 to 25 years in this basin, and we have to adapt to it. And would solar energy and other renewable energies help? I think in some ways, but we still need to identify what to do with less water in the system to sustain us.
Why, John Scott Wren on YouTube asks, why isn't there a futures market for water? And I've asked this question repeatedly. Water is free here in this part of the world. Why?
Water is free because we have such a long cultural history of water being free that is deeply embedded in our political systems. That's not a thing we're going to be able to change. We have to adapt to that reality, and there is no mechanism by which we could start putting a price on it. People have tried futures markets in water. They haven't worked terribly well, so it's not something that people haven't thought of. It just hasn't worked very well.
It just seems if something gets scarcer, it should be more expensive, right? That's supply and demand, I suppose.
That is supply and demand. I also think that water is something we all need. I mean, it's not something that you can hope for and just wish that you had more of. It's life or death in some ways. And playing it to put it in a water futures of who's the highest bidder, who gets all the water, is at the expense of some communities that are probably needing the water regardless of how much it costs.
But the other thing is we actually have done what amount to markets in water, the transactions between the Imperial Irrigation District in Los Angeles, San Diego, Palo Verde Irrigation District in Los Angeles. We're doing that.
Ken on YouTube wants to know, has Utah given up on the Lake Powell pipeline? Where does that stand? We didn't talk much about that.
It is a concept that is being developed in Utah to consider how to get water to the southern parts of it, close in St. George in that area. Have they given up on it? I think you'd have to ask somebody in Utah. I think it's still going to be something that is a concept, but whether it develops into something that's real remains to be seen.
Lots of Fish on YouTube says, there are golf courses and green lawns all over Phoenix. How is that conserving water?
Well, so if you actually look at the numbers and the satellite data, there are a lot less lawns and there are a lot fewer golf courses. And I would agree that we need to continue to move in that direction.
All right, before we go, I'd like to get your thoughts on the negotiation itself. What do you think is going to get the negotiations to a compromise? Karen, why don't you go first? I'll get the last word for John.
I think what's going to get the negotiations to a compromise is a little bit of reality and time, and a little bit of maybe locking people into a room and making sure that they understand the other side's positions a little bit more.
A lot of people want to lock the doors. John.
One of the things that we see when you look at the history of the past successful negotiations is the threat from the federal government of an alternative solution that the states will not like. I would like to see that kind of a threat. We have not seen it yet, at least in the sort of public places that we can see these negotiations emerging in the public. I think the role of the federal government is critical in being able to either lead or mediate to get this going. We haven't seen that happen in a way that I can see visibly publicly today.
All right, well, we'll be watching it closely. John Fleck, Karen Kwan, thank you for your insights. We appreciate it. And we thank all of you for your good questions. We also want to thank This American Land for their excellent archival video. I'm Miles O'Brien with PBS News. Thank you all for watching Tipping Point. So long from the Hoover Dam.
Funding for this program is provided by